All right, welcome everyone to History 1302 with Colin Picton and Northeast Texas Community College. This is Mr. Baxley, and we're about to have class. Now, the camera angle's all weird. That's because the room's been rearranged for temporarily. Don't worry about that. Okay, so let's get started. We were talking about the West yesterday, and we talked about the transformation that occurs in the country during the latter half of the 19th century. From the end of the Civil War to around the year 1900, you see a growth and expansion of settlement westward, okay? Westward expansion is going on during this time period. And we talked about like kind of the ideal, like the romantic version of westward expansion is kind of exemplified by this painting. But in reality, westward expansion, it's not always as fun and pretty and wonderful as you think it is, okay? You know, like there is this idea that you can just go out to the west, start a farm, become super wealthy all of a sudden out of nowhere. And that is true to an extent. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave 160 acres of free land to everyone who moved out west. And that was a good thing, and it got lots of people to move out west, but it wasn't easy, okay? Life as a farmer is difficult. For many of these farmers, they're living, miles and miles away from their nearest neighbor. They're very isolated, and their lives are hard. They're going to have to work hard to make a farm out of a prairie. We talked about using a steel plow. Early settlers would even build their houses out of the sod that would grow in the Great Plains, okay? And over the course of the 30 years or so, right after the Civil War, lots and lots of people moved to the Great Plains, and these states start to be settled more and more extensively, and you start to see the good land get taken first. The land that's closer to a railroad, the land that's closer to a river, the land that's more fertile and has more water, and the land that is less desirable is what's left over. But still, free land, people go. And you see more and more settlement, okay? More and more farmers. But there's a problem. This land is already occupied, okay, by Native Americans. And last semester, we talked a lot about Native Americans. At this point, by the time that the Civil War happens, Native Americans east of the Mississippi River have either been removed by things like the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson, or they are on reservations, okay? If you're east of the Mississippi River, you should not expect to have to deal with an attack from Native Americans. But west of the Mississippi River is a different story, okay? There are dozens of active tribes and thousands of Native Americans that are still living lives freely and relatively normal compared to how they had been for hundreds of years. Now, when you talk about the Native people of the Great Plains, okay, they are different from the Native Americans that colonists dealt with on the East Coast. They're different from the Native Americans like the Aztecs and the Incas that we talk about when we talk about like Spanish conquest, okay? These tend to be nomadic people, okay? We talked about how in the Great Plains, this is the exciting stuff right here. We talk about dirt. Okay, this is when sometimes y'all get jazzed up when we talk about drama. This is like the cool stuff right here. Dirt. Okay, all right. Dirt determines a lot about history. Okay, how you live, what you do, what your culture is like. You can answer those questions by looking at the dirt. Okay, for example, we live in Hopkins County. Hopkins County's soil is clay. We have all this clay, okay? It is fertile for grass. It's not really fertile for other crops like cotton, okay? You go a few miles east or a few miles west or a few miles east, you can be in a totally different region. If you go to Greenville, to Hunt County, okay, their soil is deep and thick and black, okay? And it's hardy soil. And in Hunt County, there's a lot of cotton production, okay? Hopkins County, we've got our clay. We tried cotton for a while, but this wasn't working out. In the 1930s, a lot of farmers in Hopkins County switched over to dairy because grass grows better and cows eat grass. And so we switched from losing money on cotton really to making money in dairy. And so Hopkins County became a dairy county. And then the culture of those two counties are very different. Now, Hopkins County and Hunt County, they neighbor right against each other. Sulphur Springs and Greenville, they're both Northeast Texas cities. But the feel and the vibe of those towns are very different. And it has to do with their agricultural lifestyle, what they did, how they lived. How you make food really determines a lot of like your culture. And we talked about that before with like rice in Asia and wheat in Europe and corn in the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Eastern Native Americans. But the way that people find food in the Great Plains is buffalo. Now, when you were in 4th grade, you probably had your first Texas history class. And you probably had this little assignment where your elementary teacher taught you about how the Indians used every part of the buffalo. It's really good social studies activities for little kids because kids like tactile learning experiences. And so when they see a tent and they're like, this came from a buffalo. Whoa, that makes sense. Like kids can wrap their minds around that a lot better than talking about like politics, okay? So anyways, do you guys remember that? Did you ever have to like talk about, how the Indians used every single part of the buffalo, how they used the bones to make like arrows or whatever, and they used the hides for clothing and tents, and, they used like the guts to, make their containers, okay? Well, that's true. They did. They used the buffalo for everything because that's all about they had. Okay, the Great Plains is like a big sea of grass, and most humans don't eat grass. Okay, you have to have different teeth and different stomachs to turn grass into like calories. Okay, our omnivore bodies, we don't really digest grass. If you eat grass, you'll probably just poop it out. Okay, you need like 4 stomachs, like cows do, to like eat it and chew on it, eat it and chew on it, eat it, chew on it, back and forth to really get to the point where your grass turns into calories, okay? But humans can eat buffalo. So throughout the Great Plains, there were millions and millions of buffaloes all across what is now the United States, Canada, and Mexico, okay? And these buffalo provided vital nutrients and vital materials, all sorts of things that people needed, resources they needed to survive, they got from the buffalo. And that changed the culture. In the land of the Aztecs, they had cities, okay? In the eastern United States, they were more mobile than, you would think the Europeans would be, but they did move a little bit, but they had like kind of territories that they patrolled, the Native Americans in the eastern United States, and they had villages that were more permanent. But the people of the Great Plains are nomadic, okay? They're nomadic and their lives revolve around the buffalo. Hunting the buffalo, following the buffalo herds. And so this changes their culture, okay? In Europe, where you have wheat farms and you have mills and you have all these heavy equipment that has to stay in one place, people are more territorial and people have a concept that you can literally own land. Like this piece of dirt is my dirt. It's not your dirt. You come on it, I will shoot you. That's like a very European concept and in other parts of the world, okay? But for Native Americans, especially the ones of the Great Plains, you didn't like own land. That didn't make sense. There'd be no point. There'd be no benefit because you're following the buffalo. But rather, you would have territory, large pieces of land that would belong to the tribe. Okay, and you would have buffalo herds that would belong to the tribe, okay? And a lot of times the religion of these Native Americans, ties them very closely to the land. It ties them very closely to animals. And they see a lot of like balance and, harmony and interweaving of like, them, the planet, the animals, the spirits, all those sorts of things. And so this is a very different culture from the Native Americans that you see in the eastern part of the United States and in the rest of it. They're nomadic, okay? And because they're nomads, that leads to some conflicts with the United States. Now, the farmers, they are farmers. They want to own land. They want to set up this piece of land as their own. And for a lot of these farmers that come in the Homestead Act of 1862, they go and stake out a claim and they don't see no Indians. There are no Indians around, okay? They stake out a claim, they farm on it for months, and then all of a sudden, a tribe of Indians comes through because they're nomadic. Okay, they travel around constantly. Okay, and then they get into conflict and say, why are you on our land? Okay, and then that conflict leads to eventually violence. And then when violence starts to happen, then the Americans, they call on the military, and the military, which is done fighting the Civil War, is now pouring resources into pacifying the frontier. There's a conflict of civilizations. There's a conflict of identities and ways of living life, okay? For Americans, we don't like nomads, okay? Nomads, in fact, in most what we would call civilized societies, which is kind of a loaded term and can even be considered racist by some, most of like modern societies hate nomadic people, okay? Like the government does not like it when people move around, okay? And it's very difficult to be someone who moves around. So like migrant farmers, okay, that are still around even today, there are a lot of people, there are people even in the school that are from migrant families, okay? Those people live difficult lives because they're constantly moving, and it just makes everything complicated, okay? How many times have you signed up for something and you had to give an address, okay? How many times have you ever had, and one day when you grow up and you move and you change addresses, you're gonna have to go through and like change every single little form to say I've moved, okay? And it's a pain in the butt, okay? But if you move like every few months, that's even more difficult, okay? Or if you're constantly moving, how do they find you to pay taxes? How do you figure out where you're gonna vote? All these things that like a modern society kind of takes for granted, the standardization of society, doesn't really work when you're nomads, okay? And so for many Americans, they just look at Native Americans and they view them as just like savages. They don't live lives like we do. They don't have houses. They don't own land. They share everything in their tribe. You know, this is weird. This isn't right. We need to teach them how to be like us, okay? And so there's a lot of disdain, and there's racism, and there's a lot of contention and conflict that stews, okay? The idea of a frontier is that you are on the edge of civilization and there is nothing beyond it, or everything beyond is unknown and new. But many people argue that the word frontier should be replaced with border, which might be more appropriate. That there is a border of settlement between people of the United States and Native Americans, okay? And there's a big conflict that occurs during the years between 1865 and 1890, okay? Over the course of the 30 years after the Civil War, there are dozens of Native American tribes who are systematically fought, hunted down, either killed or put on reservations throughout the West, okay? By 1890, all of these tribes are on these things called reservations, designated areas of land specifically for Native Americans. But how does it get that way? Well, first thing we need to do, let's look at this map, okay? So this map shows us the names of different Native American tribes and their approximate locations, okay? So like the Navajo, the Paiute, the Nez Perce, the Crow, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Apaches, etc., okay? Then, if you look, there's these little star-shaped things. These are fortresses. They're forts of the U.S. military. And then when you see crossing swords, those are battles, okay? We don't have enough time to talk about every single battle in the Indian Wars, okay? But what might be helpful is for us to kind of just talk about a typical fight between Native Americans and the United States, okay? So the first thing you need to understand is railroads, okay? The United States is actively building railroads throughout the 1860s, 1870s, 80s, and 90s, connecting the United States with from the east to the west, okay? I believe it's 1869 when Ulysses Grant, I believe 1869 or 1870, you might correct me, whenever Ulysses Grant, he puts the final, when he's president, he puts the final stake in the Transcontinental Railroad that connects the east to the west. And I have a whole thing about the Transcontinental Railroad later on. But what you need to know is that makes it a lot easier for people to settle. It makes it a lot easier for people to travel to the Great Plains to become farmers. And along the railroads, you tend to have a lot of strong positions for United States citizens and safety. The railroad is the tether to the outside world. And then there are forts, okay? Where the forts are, that's where the U.S. military has put out outposts, and those tend to be protected and safe for American citizens and settlements. So a lot of people tend to live near forts, okay? All right? One famous fort that some of you might be familiar with is Fort Worth, okay? Fort Worth used to be basically where the West started in Texas, okay? Eastern part of Texas, if you were east of Fort Worth, you were pretty well safe from Native Americans. If you go west of Fort Worth, it gets pretty wild, okay? Right? And life in West Texas was very different from life in East Texas during this time period. Fort Worth was kind of like, you're safe. When you go out away from the fort, we can't protect you as well. You're out on your own. So if you're near a railroad or you're near a fort, you're pretty well safe, okay? But if you're trying to get land to start your homestead, you've got to probably go further than just the fort or the railroad because that gets claimed first, okay? So you go out into the middle of Nebraska, okay? You go out in the middle of Colorado, you go out in the middle of Wyoming, and you start a homestead, okay? And when you start your homestead, you get into a routine, right? You settle on land. This is the first step of the Indian Wars. Step one, in a typical Indian war. Step one, the U.S. citizens, U.S. farmers, citizens, whatever, settle on Native American land. Okay, the United States is giving away this land for free, but the Native Americans, they're the ones that are controlling it. But again, there's a difference between the world on paper and the world on reality. On paper, all of that land belongs to the government of the United States, the public stuff they bought with the Louisiana Purchase back in 1803. But in reality, it's been filled with and settled by and lived on with Native Americans for years and years and years and years and years, okay? So, U.S. farmers settle on Native American land, okay? Eventually, what's going to happen is the Native Americans are going to get upset that there are settlers on their land, okay? And there'll be some type of conflict. It's different in every case. Sometimes they talk it out. Sometimes the Americans shoot first. Sometimes Indians shoot first. It's different in different cases. But what happens is that eventually there's a fight, okay? Okay? Indians, and Americans fight, and people die, okay? People start getting killed, okay? If you were a settler out on the Great Plains, that was probably your biggest fear, okay? There's tornadoes, there's grass fires, there's drought, there's grasshoppers, all sorts of things could ruin your day or your year. But a Native American attack could end your life, okay? Right? If you're out on your own, okay, imagine you're just a farmer, okay? All right, so Mr. M, you got your farm, right? Okay, you got your wife, you got your kids, you're farming, okay? You got your cows, you got your sheep, you got your corn, you got your little homestead, having a good time. But you are out on the Great Plains, completely exposed. There's no forest to run to cover. There's no fortress. Basically, you've got your house. And you've got a gun, yeah. You've got a little shotgun to shoot some birds. You got a little rifle to go hunting, okay? But that's it, all right? And it's just you and your wife and your kids. And one day, you're out on the farm and you see just lots of Indians just pop up out of nowhere, okay? Some Indians pop up and they come on and they attack, okay? Now, you may not be aware of the fact that you've settled on their land and they've been having fights with the federal government and there have been Indians that have been attacked by American soldiers elsewhere. You don't know that. You don't know that American soldiers in the next county have been skirmishing back and forth with Native Americans and they burned down a Native American village. You don't know that. All you know is that your wife and your kids and you are about to get killed, okay? So you call your family into the house, you board up the windows, you load up your rifle and your shotgun, you give your shotgun to your wife, and you say if anyone comes to the door, you shoot them. Okay, you get your rifle ready, okay, and you shoot, and then you got to reload. You're reloading your single shot smoothbore musket because you're poor, you don't have a lot of money, so you're reloading your musket. Okay, while you're reloading, the Indians are shooting back at you with bows and arrows. They can shoot a lot faster than you can. Pretty soon, you've taken an arrow to the knee. Okay, you're falling down. Okay, the Indians, they get into your house. Okay, they kill your wife. They steal your kids. They run off with them, and then you get to get scalped. Okay, all right, Nathan, Mr. B. I would like to demonstrate scalping if you're willing. Okay. All right. I'm gonna wash my hands. Okay. Is that all right? Yeah. Is that okay? I'm gonna touch your hair. That's about it. Okay. All right. So this is not a knife. It's a pair of scissors. Okay, and it's closed. All right. So to be scalped is a horrible, horrible way to be killed. And sometimes you don't even die. Sometimes you live for a long time afterwards. Sometimes you live for a few days. Sometimes you live. If you don't get infected, you might live the rest of your life. If you get infected, you might die. Okay. Anyways, this was a way that Native Americans would take trophies after a battle. This was like a way to terrorize their enemies, to strike fear in their hearts, to say, don't you dare come back on our land, or else this will happen to you too. And some Native Americans would like keep scalps on like their clothes as like trophies and like braid them or whatever and like put them on the thing. But anyway, what you do, you grab somebody's hair at the front, okay, and you pull. And you pull until the skin starts to get pulled up. And you can take a knife, sharp knife, and just cut the very top of the skin, okay, where it starts to separate. You know when your skin, you can almost pull it off your bone a little bit. You just pull that real tight, you get the cut started, and then you just yank it off. And then you got the scalp, okay? You probably won't die right away, okay? Now you might bleed out for the arrows, you might other things, but getting scalped is a real fear, and it happens. Okay, right? Nathan, he's scalped. Okay, his wife, bad things happened to her, and she's killed. His kids are taken off. His little babies are taken off, and they're going to get raised up as Indians in the Indian tribe somewhere. And then Nathan is left to just either try to get help or die or die of his wounds. Okay, and that happens, okay? Now, to be fair, there is death and destruction on both sides. American soldiers kill way more Indians, okay? They make up for it, all right, as far as like killing goes. But for Nathan, just a simple farmer, he has been told by his government that this land is his for free. He's gone out here to make a better life for his family. He's not thinking about all like the political ramifications. For him and his family, this is the death sentence, okay? And this thing happened. Maybe not exactly this way, but these stories happen. And they happen in places close to us, okay? How many of you have ever been to a place called Jacksonville? Tyler, Texas, okay? Jacksonville, Texas, there is a massacre. We'll just take a quick little detour, okay? I think it's called like Kilo or something. Yeah, the Kilo Massacre. All right, you can go and see this monument that they put up for the Kilo Massacre. Okay, this happened a little bit earlier than the time period we're talking about, but Friday, October 5th, 1838 in East Texas, very close to Jacksonville, there is this awful, awful massacre of these families. They were like, the men went out hunting, okay? The men went out hunting they weren't hunting. The men went out farming. And when they went out farming, they forgot. They like went out to their land to go farm and they forgot to bring their gun. Okay. And then they got like just completely just raided by this group of, I believe, Cherokee Indians that they attacked the settlement. They killed a total of 18, either killed or abducted. Okay. There's another story of this woman named Cynthia Ann Parker. Okay. Cynthia Ann Parker, she was a little girl. in Texas, and her family was attacked by a group of Comanche. They killed a lot of her family members, and they captured her, and they raised her as an Indian. She lived her life as a Comanche. She married a Comanche man. She had a son. His name was Quanah Parker, and he will become very important later on in this story. Okay, but Quanah Parker was like the last of the Comanche like war chiefs to fight against America. Anyways, but she eventually was recaptured by Americans. Okay, Americans attacked like some village that she was in, and the only way they knew that she was a white woman was because she had blue eyes. Like she had lived among the natives for so long, she dressed like they did. She'd been out in the sun. She was really tan, and so like she was indistinguishable from other Comanche Indians, except for she had blue eyes. And then the commander, like the military put it together, and they're like, wait a minute, she's Cynthia Ann Parker, that little girl that went missing like decades ago. And of course, when she went back to like live with Americans, she was like miserable because she was a Comanche. She'd been raised a Comanche, her whole life. She'd been like, she was a little girl when she was captured. So like she had forgotten a lot of stuff. She'd been raised up as Comanche. And so she had married a Comanche man, but that sort of thing would happen. Those were fears that settlers had. So what do the settlers do in response? Okay, well, they call the military, the fortresses. They call. Whenever the military gets wind of the fact that natives are on the loose, running and fighting and attacking, they fight back. Okay, so the U.S. military comes in and fights. Now that the Civil War is over, the U.S. military pours resources into pacifying the frontier. The U.S. military fights Native Americans. Now, we're going to talk about a few of these battles. Okay, the U.S. military fights the Indians. We're going to talk about a few of the individual battles, but in general, what happens is that American soldiers win battles where it's a straight open fight. Okay, where it is just clear out in the open fighting. American soldiers have better weapons, especially as the war continues. The advancement in technology, having repeating rifles, having repeating revolvers, okay, having just eventually you start to see machine guns being used in this war. Machine guns are actually pioneered during the Civil War. The early Gatling gun was one of the first machine guns, but they're being used effectively in the war against Native Americans. Okay, Native Americans have no answer to cannons. They have no answer to machine guns. They can't attack and defeat the fortresses. So what Native Americans have to do, since they usually can't win an open battle, is they have to rely on guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is not when you get two monkeys to fight. Guerrilla warfare, spelled G-U-E-R-I-L-L-A, is when an inferior force fights a defensive war against a superior force using ambush tactics and partisan warfare tactics. So what that means is they don't fight out in the open. They wait till American soldiers are out on patrol, miles away from the fort. It's one of our first vocabulary words. Yes, we use it like they pick off a few at a time. They wait till they're far away from the fortress. Yeah, it was in the Revolutionary War. We used it in the Revolution against the British. Okay, and Indians use it against us in this war. Okay, they know the terrain better. They're able to be sneaky. They're able to attack and ambush, set up traps. But Native Americans are never quite able to finish off American settlements. Okay, because eventually settlers figure out, okay, we're going to live closer to the forts. We're going to, put our houses closer together. We're going to defend ourselves. Okay, and so Native Americans tend to rely on terror tactics because they can't take out a fort. They have to scare people. Okay, Native Americans don't have the firepower to take out Fort Worth. Does that make sense? They don't have the ability to besiege a fortress and just conquer it, because most of the time, if the fort is secure, got cannons, machine guns, walls, the Indians can't capture it. So what they have to do instead is to do terror. If they can scare settlers to think, if I settle in this land, I may get killed, my scalp may be tore off, my kids might get kidnapped, okay, my wife might get raped, those things might happen. If you can make them be afraid, then they won't come to your land. So that's like the tactic that ends up being used, is to terrify settlers from coming in. And again, for the Native Americans, they're just defending their land in their own view, okay? But for Americans, we hear about people dying and we call these massacres, okay? For American soldiers and for just Americans in general, the idea that women and children are involved in this warfare is very, very like, we don't like it. See, our concept of warfare is that soldiers go fight other soldiers, but you shouldn't go kill civilians. That's like the American concept of warfare that comes from European warfare, back when there are knights and nobles and they go fight, and then the peasants, they stay at home and farm, okay? Like that sort of idea. But Native Americans, their warfare gets messy, and so Americans get messy back, and we start killing Native American civilians, men, women, and children too. And the whole war just gets really messy, okay? And a lot of people are angry on both sides. And these wars continue, but eventually the Indians lose in every case. Somehow, some way they lose. And we'll talk about different ways that the U.S. ensures that they lose, but eventually they lose. And so, step 4, Indians lose. They're forced to sign treaties where they agree to live on reservations. Okay, they get confined. They cannot roam, but they are confined to reservations. Okay? When you leave class today, take a moment and look at this map on the wall. Okay? If you're online, look up Indian reservations. But Indian reservations are actually marked on this map in orange. You can see like different spots where Indians, even today, still live on land that has been reserved for them. Okay? They go from owning it all to owning very little. Okay? Now, what happens a lot of times, though, is that this process repeats itself. And Americans move on to reservation land, and then they get into conflicts, and then people start dying. And when people start dying, they call the military out. The military goes and fights, and then they lose even more, and then they go on even smaller reservations. Okay? There are multiple treaties that the United States breaks during this war. Okay? And there are countless, basically this happens over and over and over again to just about every tribe, and sometimes multiple times per tribe, until they're basically all put on reservations and this lifestyle that they live ends. Okay? This is a policy of concentration. Okay? The U.S. pressured tribes to sign treaties limiting the boundaries of their hunting grounds to reservations. Okay, the Sioux to the Dakotas, the Cheyenne to the foothills of Colorado, and some tribes like the Navajo are moved at rifle point. Okay, many of these treaties are basically broken almost immediately. Okay, despite treaty claims that their provisions would last as long as waters run, quote, land-hungry pioneers broke the promise of the government time after time by squatting on Indian territory and demanding federal protection. The government, in turn, forced more restrictive agreements on the Western tribes, and the cycle of promises made and broken continued until we basically have a full-scale war, which ends in the Indians losing. Okay? So, I don't want to get into all of this right now, but we need to talk about Custer. Okay. Now, before we talk about Custer, we'll talk about the biggest battle with Custer's last stand, hopefully, next week.
Custer in South Dakota?
What? Yeah, South Dakota, Little Bighorn was actually in Montana, but it's in that area. Like the Black Hills is part of South Dakota. Anyways, but what really wins the war eventually for the United States, number 1, numbers, number 2, technology. We just have more people. We're able to win a war of attrition. We have more technology, which we can win battles with. But what really wins the war is Americans eventually just start massacring buffalo. It's a lot easier to kill a buffalo than to kill a person, okay? And so the United States starts putting out bounties on buffalo, okay? And buffalo hunters can make money just by selling the ear of a buffalo, just to prove that like you killed a buffalo or whatever. You know, you don't have to like use the whole carcass. So there are literally moments where there are trains that are moving slowly, surrounded by herds of buffalo, and there are buffalo hunters on top, just like unloading on herds of buffalo as they drive by. Okay, the buffalo are the source of food and supplies and materials for Native Americans. And once those buffaloes are removed, It's hard to win a war. Remember who wins the war? The person with the most stuff. Okay? The stuff that Native Americans rely upon comes from buffaloes. You take that away from them, they can't fight. If you're hungry, tired, cold, don't have clothes, don't have supplies, you can't fight. And the government offers protection and even food and provisions to Native Americans if they agree to go on the reservations. This policy still continues today. Native Americans who live on reservations today receive benefits from the federal government as part of like the treaty agreements, okay? And today, Native Americans get like money from the government to survive as long as they live on the reservation, okay? Which creates all kinds of problems throughout history. And Native American reservations today are really, there's a lot of problems and messed up stuff. They tend to have some of the highest rates of poverty, suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, bad stuff. And we'll hopefully get into that more next week. So next week, I'm going to teach you about, hopefully, a man that was very, very cocky. You know, he was a handsome young man who thought he might be president one day, but he ends up dying full of arrows, okay? And that will be our lesson about General George Armstrong Custer, all right? Y'all have a great day. Do good things, be good people, make good choices, okay? Enjoy your weekend.